use it to show someone's guilt or to prove the guilt or to convince a jury that, of someone's guilt, even though we only have class evidence. So the fact that it's class evidence does not mean we should discard it in any way. It is still very useful by itself. So we have to be careful here, because remember what we said earlier about those 1 out of 100? Now, if you're the lawyer for the defense, you're going to say, whoa, bedspread is 1 in 100 chance? I don't agree. These are very, very popular bedspreads. It's not a 1 in 100 chance. It's more like a 1 out of 5 chance. Paint scrapings? Look, everybody in the city goes to the same car painter or whatever they're called, the same automotive shop, and it's very likely that he painted everybody's car the same color. So the chances that that he and the other guy in the town got the same paint job is not 1 in 100. It's maybe 1 out of 5. And the tire track, same pattern. Look, it's a very popular pattern. Maybe it's only 1 out of 3 chance that he coincidentally has the same tire tracks. You multiply 1 out of 5 and 1 out of 5, 1 out of 3, you're actually going to get something. You're going to get less than 1 out of 100. So is it feasible that it was actually somebody else? Because a lot of people, not just 1 out of 100, have the same bedspreads and paint and tires. If 1 or 2 out of 100 people have the same exact 3 things together, well, then it is reasonable to say that this guy just happens to be one of those random people, because it's not uncommon. That's what they're going to argue. They're going to argue that it's not 1 in 100 chance. So if you have the numbers, the lawyer will not be able to argue against it. But if you don't have the numbers, you have to rely on reasonable things. How reasonable is it that everybody in the town buys the same bedspread, or half the people buy the same? Well, look around, and presumably the jury are going to be thinking the same way. Look around. I visited 10 friends, and they never have the same ones, so it's probably less than 1 out of 10. Same car? I don't know. I look around at hundreds of cars a day, and I see that they almost never have the same. It's not 1 in 100, it's more like 1 in 500. Again, sometimes you have to rely on common sense. Sometimes you just don't have the numbers, but you have a ballpark figure, you have an idea, and you use that. So, class evidence is very useful, but that doesn't mean that if you have it, it automatically shows guilt. And the fact that we don't know the probability doesn't mean that we can't show any guilt. We have to think. We have to use our common sense. And remember, as someone who works with forensics, or as a jury member, who knows, someone who works with forensics, someone who works in a lab, you should know how people argue back and forth and what they're going to do with class evidence. How lawyers do things, and how, if you're an expert witness, you may be made to look bad if they can challenge you on the probabilities. So if you're an expert witness, either either do some research on the probabilities, or admit that you don't know the probabilities, but again, say the truth. That is your job as an expert witness. So there are ideas of how much class evidence would actually individualize it to a person. How much makes it extremely improbable? We didn't mention that. Is it 1 out of 100? 1 out of 1,000? What's the probability we're saying, it's got to be him? If it's only 1 out of 1,000 chance that he's innocent, or 1 out of 100 chance, 1 out of 10 chance that he's innocent? I mean, again, this is something that has to be decided on a case-by-case basis. Some of the examples are, let's say you have, we know that the criminal, whatever, in a car accident, the hit-and-run person, the guilty one, they left a paint chip there. And it doesn't have just the outer layer, it has the outer layer and then 5 layers below that. Because you paint over other paint layers. So you have 5 layers of paint. And then we go to the suspect and we take a sample of his car and we find the exact same 5 layers. So 1 layer of paint might be class characteristics, but 5 of them? That's extremely unlikely that they're all exactly the same. It must be he was the guy. So, but how many layers of paint does it take? I mean, I think 5 layers is plenty, but what about 3 layers? Maybe people do have the same, they do have the same, painting and repainting the same kinds of paint. Or maybe no, that's very improbable. Maybe it's 2. How much? Same thing with striations of a bullet markings. Now hopefully we'll get to this later, but striations will actually identify a bullet to a specific gun, usually owned by a suspect. So how many striations though? These are little scratch marks on the bullet. How many? If one scratch mark, bullets can have hundreds of these little scratch marks. If one of them matches, I mean, that's probably not enough. What about 3? What about 10? That sounds like it'll match 10 of them. That it makes it very likely that it is a match. But 1, probably not. 2, maybe. 3, not really. Again, it's debatable. The amount is actually debatable. How many bits of class evidence it takes to make something individual evidence, an individual characteristic, or making it so highly improbable that he's innocent that we can assume it's clear evidence that this is the individual that's associated with the bit of evidence. So it's the same thing with natural variations, because it's a similar idea with natural variations. For example, even fingerprints. That's pretty much as individualist as we can get, because nobody, as far as we know, has the same fingerprints. But if you take the fingerprints from the same person, you put them under a really, really powerful microscope, you will find that the same person will have slightly different things. A tiny little microscopic crack, is a little different. It might even be because they squished their finger down a little bit more during one of the fingerprint, samplings. Every 2 things, if you analyze them well enough, you'll find a tiny, tiny difference. So if you show 2 different bits of evidence, you're saying, well, we see that this connects the 2. Let's say striations of a gun, scratch marks in the bullet, connecting it to the gun, let's say. But even these scratch marks, when you connect them, if you analyze them really, really, really thoroughly, you'll find their differences. Do these differences show that it really wasn't the same one? Usually we can tell, but that's also some argument that can be made, that you're claiming that they're the same. Wait, it's not exactly the same. Although that's usually easier to tell. But it's something that when you analyze evidence, when you make your conclusions, you make your report as to the evidence that you see as a forensic analyst, or as a lawyer, or as someone who is being an expert witness, you should be thinking about that. That sometimes it's not exactly, you think it's the same, but when you get very close, it's not the same, and maybe that's indicative that it really isn't the same, even though you have to examine it more closely. Anyway, this is something that again, it is decided in courtrooms, but you have to understand, the various possibilities. And this is like the bottom line. How much credence is given to evidence that is shown? Do not assume that just because it sounds sciencey, just because they used a compound microscope or a comparison microscope,